Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Gina Pinnell. I'm from Central District Health. This evening, we're going to have a presentation from our medical director, Dr. Sandy Mudge, as she talks about the COVID-19 vaccine specifically for youth, as we have some questions about how it impacts them and just in general to give an informational session to the youth and to the parents out there. So Dr. Mudge, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gina. So I'll wait for our slides to come up here for 1 second. And as Gina mentioned, today we're specifically talking about the vaccine for adolescents ages 12 to 15. So next slide, please. Why we're talking about this and kind of setting in context. Statistics for COVID-19 in Idaho as of yesterday, over 110,000 people were estimated to have recovered from the illness. Over 8,000 people were hospitalized, 1,400 people in the ICU. 10,000 or more healthcare workers were infected with this, and 26 kids were ill with multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which is a very severe illness after having COVID, where the immune system kind of has a very strong inflammatory reaction, often causing the child to be hospitalized or in the ICU, and has some long-term ramifications. So that's why we're kind of setting the stage and talking about it today. Next slide. We're very fortunate since the COVID vaccine has been rolled out. We've seen lots of decreases in both amount of people ill with COVID-19 and also with the deaths in COVID-19. And these are some Idaho case counts and deaths. In Idaho, we have seen a big drop since wintertime and in December when vaccines were rolled out. Unfortunately, it's not zero. We're still seeing somewhere between 150 to 350 cases per day in Idaho still. So still here in our community and affecting all of us. And we're also still seeing some people die from it, unfortunately. So we have not completely taken care of this issue quite yet. Go ahead and next slide, please. Ages that are most affected by it, we see on this graph, tends to be ages 18 to 29 that we know about. We know that younger kids tend to have more asymptomatic infections or are less likely to be tested. That number could be a lot higher. But on this graph we're showing in Idaho, we think there's been at least 20 to 25,000 kids that have been infected, ages 0 to 17. Next slide, please. So how many vaccines for COVID-19 are there? Just kind of setting the stage for what is the situation with the vaccines worldwide. And there were 49 vaccines worldwide that were brought to starting of clinical trials. And so far, 8 of those have been approved worldwide, but only 3 of them in the United States. And 4 of those vaccines were out of the 49 were actually abandoned during the trials because they just didn't work as well. But many of them are still, we're still watching and waiting and seeing how they do in the clinical trials. But we're lucky to have 3 already approved here in the US. Next slide, please. The 3 that we have in the US, as you guys probably know, are Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. Both of those are mRNA vaccines. They're both 2-shot vaccines. For Pfizer, it's you repeat the dose after 3 weeks, and for Moderna, it's after 4 weeks. Both of these are considered to be somewhere 90 to 95% effective, so these are very, very good vaccines. And right now, Pfizer currently has an emergency use authorization for people 12 and older, and Moderna has an indication for 18 and older. Usually, Moderna is about two weeks or maybe a month behind Pfizer for when it's petitioned the FDA for approval. So we suspect that Moderna will also be approved for ages 12 and up in the next few weeks or month. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine called Janssen is approved for 18 and older, and that's a 1-shot vaccine. Next slide, please. And just, I know that there's a lot of concern out there about how we got these vaccines and safety data and long-term data. So we're going to touch on that a little bit throughout the presentation. Just to kind of set that stage, how do vaccines get approved? So there's initially some laboratory studies, and we were really lucky. Something that helped speed up all of this process for us was that mRNA vaccines, which we're talking about specifically today, were actually studied for the SARS outbreak and then again the MERS outbreak, so in 2003 and about 2010. So we had a lot of that laboratory data and that initial scientific breakthrough already 20 years ago. And then all vaccines go through clinical testing, and that starts with phase 1 when there's tens of people who are being tested for safety. Then it goes up to phase 2, hundreds of people for safety and effectiveness. And then phase 3, that's the last phase of the major clinical trials. And that's usually thousands of people. And we're looking for dosage, safety, and effectiveness. And then phase 4 is once the vaccine is allowed out in public, and it's the follow-up studies that are being done years afterwards. Next slide, please. So the way that we're able to get these vaccines so quickly in response to this pandemic that we're undergoing currently is that instead of doing a traditional timeline where everything was stretched out and one thing had to happen before the next thing had to happen before the next thing, we actually overlapped many of the steps so that we could provide them to the public as soon as possible. So as I mentioned, a lot of the exploratory laboratory preclinical work has been done over the past 20 years. So they were kind of primed and ready to go with the mRNA vaccine already. They just had to study coronavirus specifically, make sure that they could reproduce the mRNA that would cause a spike protein. I'll show you a picture of that in a few slides. And then after that, it was pretty simple to get it manufactured and out into clinical studies. Once they started clinical studies, they did each clinical study, each phase of each trial, just exactly how every vaccine has ever been done. But instead of waiting for every single thing to happen and then doing the next phase, they overlapped them. So the FDA was continuing to monitor and look and decide on each step as it was being done. And they started manufacturing in the clinical trials instead of waiting for FDA approval at the very end, so that as soon as it was complete, we would be able to have access to the public. So that really shortened the timeline. Instead of waiting for 10 to 15 years, everything could be done in about a year. Next slide, please. And emergency use authorization is something that I know people are a little bit skeptical about. This is actually a mechanism that has been around for a long time. It was put in place well before this current pandemic, and it's there to provide medical countermeasures such as vaccines in a public health emergency. So even though this is an emergency use authorization, there's still very strict criteria that need to be met. And some of those criteria are that there has to be at least 3,000 participants in the trials and at least 2 months follow-up before it can even be brought for consideration. Luckily for us, we actually had in the 2 mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, we had 90,000 people in the clinical trial. So we had lots of good data. And this data is looked at by the FDA, but also by an independent study board that reviews all the safety data and all the scientific data to make sure that they agree that it's a safe thing to move forward. Next slide, please. In the study that was specific for adolescents that was performed more recently, so this was in addition to those initial tests, they enrolled 2,260 adolescents ages 12 to 15, and they watched and saw how things went. So they found that the kids who got vaccinated had 100% protection against COVID-19 infection. That means nobody got a COVID-19 infection in the vaccinated group. Now, in real-world data, that may be a little bit different, but we've seen it in adults, and everybody else has been allowed to be vaccinated to be up to 95% effective. So I think it will be really good. Also, blood work that was taken from the group that got vaccinated showed antibody levels similar to or better than older groups. And it was very well tolerated. The side effects are very similar to the older groups, such as the ages 16 to 25 that had been tested previously. There were maybe just a few more people who had fevers, but that was considered acceptable or normal because kids have a very more strong and robust immune system, so we expect them to mount a little bit more of an inflammatory response when their immune system revs up. Next slide, please. So how these mRNA vaccines work, it's really actually quite simple. This design is very ingenious, I believe. The ingredients basically are fat, sugar, salt, and a little bit of mRNA, which is the the information that the body transcribes to make a spike protein, which are the little spikes that come off of the virus body. And that's what is unique about coronavirus. And so making one of the spike proteins, they never transcribe or make a whole virus, but just the little proteins that look like spikes. That's what causes your body to make antibodies. So how it works is that they wrap the little bit of mRNA in a fat particle. Then the cell incorporates that into the outside of the cell. It's always in the periphery. It never goes into the nucleus where the DNA is stored, so it can never be in contact with your DNA. The mRNA, the fat particle is dissolved, and then the mRNA is released to be transcribed by this thing called a ribosome, as in the picture. And then that makes the spike protein, and then the mRNA, the fat particle, is all destroyed. So nothing is left from what is in the vaccine. It's just what is read and what your body is made to therefore trigger the antibody response from your immune system. Next slide, please. And because this is, although we've had it for 20 years, considered new technology, there are a lot of myths circulating on social media and out in the public. So let's talk about a couple of those. One is that it was rushed and isn't safe. And as I mentioned, there were no safety shortcuts. They instead just didn't do it in a linear fashion. They did it all one on top of each other so that we could produce it as quickly as possible in response to the pandemic. Another is that it might change your DNA. And again, as I just mentioned, the mRNA encased in the little fat particle never goes anywhere near the nucleus. And as soon as it's done its job, it is completely destroyed by the cell itself. So that it's not possible for it to change your DNA. Some people think that potentially it could give you COVID-19, and that's not possible because it never produces a live virus. There are some vaccines that do have a weakened strain of a live virus, and this is not one of them. It in no way can give you COVID-19. But it can give you some side effects, and that's another one of the myths, that it could cause severe side effects, and we'll talk about those. They typically are mild to moderate, but they do feel a lot like you have the flu for some people, so that can be a little uncomfortable. And then some people worry that it might contain an allergen, like egg protein. Other people have said metal or pork products, and it actually does not contain any of those. Very simple, like I said. And so while if you do have an allergy that you're concerned about, you will be provided with a brochure to look through it, and you should also ask your medical provider about your particular allergy. But in general, the more common things that people are concerned about vaccines containing, this one does not contain those. And then finally, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time about the myth that it could cause infertility. I know for all parents that would obviously be a very real concern. Fortunately, there is absolutely no evidence that this vaccine causes infertility. In the initial studies with Pfizer, there were actually quite a few women who got pregnant during the time that they were undergoing vaccination and in the phase 3 study. And none of the women in the vaccine group had even a miscarriage. Many of them have had normal, healthy babies since. And there was only one miscarriage, and that was actually in the placebo group, the group that didn't get the vaccine. Also, since Pfizer has been distributed in the public in December, so we have about going on 6 months, many women have gotten pregnant, and there has been no evidence that there's been any concerns with having been vaccinated. Many pregnant women are taking the vaccine, and there's been no concerns either in the public or in the studies that are now being performed. In fact, we find that it actually is protective to the baby, to the fetus, and then the baby if it's breastfed. And we also know that this vaccine produces antibodies that are what your immune system produces, that is pretty equivalent to what a natural infection, or if you get an infection with COVID-19 out in the community, produces. And there has also been no indication that a natural infection from COVID-19 would hurt anybody's fertility. So therefore, there is absolutely no evidence that this vaccine causes infertility. Next slide, please. So what should you expect when signing up your child for the Pfizer vaccine? I know many people are probably already vaccinated, but if you haven't chosen to be vaccinated yet, I just wanted to let you know what to kind of expect. Pfizer vaccines are, as I mentioned, a 2-dose series. They're 3 weeks apart. when Moderna gets approved, it'll be 4 weeks apart. For both of the mRNA vaccines, you're considered fully vaccinated 2 weeks after your second dose. So you have to wait 2 weeks after your second dose before you really are considered fully vaccinated. You can get the second dose up to 6 weeks after the first dose, but we prefer to do it either at the 3-week or 4-week mark, respectively, for Pfizer and Moderna. After the vaccination, your child will be asked to wait 15 to 30 minutes in the waiting room, and that's just to monitor for an allergic reaction just in case. And if so, then they are very well equipped to handle that. I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that COVID-19 vaccines are available at no cost, regardless of your health insurance status. Your health insurance can be charged for it, but none of that charge should be put on you, and there should be no administration fee. So you should not pay anything at all for the COVID-19 vaccines. The government is absorbing all the costs. Also, previously, people were told to wait 14 days before or after the COVID-19 vaccine before getting other vaccines, and we've done away with that. Now, both the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics recommend obtaining all regular vaccines at the same time as the COVID-19 vaccines to avoid vaccine delays. So if you're going for a well child check at your pediatrician's office and they offer the COVID-19 vaccine, you can get all the regular vaccines plus the COVID-19 vaccine at the same time. Next slide, please. Adverse reactions to COVID-19 vaccines are real. Up to 80% of Pfizer and 89% of Moderna recipients had some reaction. Most of them are primarily pain at the injection site, just like if you get a tetanus shot. Other things that people have experienced: headache, fatigue, muscle pain, fevers and chills, and sometimes nausea or redness or swelling at the injection site. Most of these happen in the first 1 to 3 days. Most of the time, they last from 6 to 48 hours, and most people consider them mild to moderate symptoms. As a reminder, most of the time, the second vaccine causes more reaction than the first vaccine. And just to put this in perspective, this is actually a good thing. This means these adverse reactions mean that your body's building protection. It's protecting you against any future contact with the COVID-19 vaccine in the community. And younger kids will have probably a stronger immune reaction, like I mentioned before, than older adults. So just be aware of that as well. Next slide. They just have a healthier immune system. People have been worried about something called anaphylaxis. That's when somebody can't breathe because of a severe allergic reaction. And a study that was done in December, so back when we first started getting these to the public, after 2 million doses of Pfizer, they had received 21 cases of anaphylaxis, but 17 out of those 21 people actually had a history of prior severe allergic reactions to injectable medicines or vaccines. And so therefore, there is a recommendation that someone who has that history should not get the mRNA vaccine. So they currently are citing that there's 2 to 5 cases per million doses of anaphylaxis with the mRNA vaccines, but I suspect that's actually quite a bit less, because if we don't have people already have that history, there's going to be a lot less cases of it. And that's even the 2 to 5 per million doses are pretty much in line with all other vaccines and are actually quite a bit less than many of the medicines that we prescribe daily. Next slide. So as I mentioned, who shouldn't get the COVID vaccine? Anybody who's had an anaphylactic reaction or stopped breathing to any other injectable medicine or vaccine, or to the first dose of an mRNA vaccine, they should not get this vaccine. Also, if you're allergic to any component of the vaccine, then you should not get this vaccine. If you've been probably pretty ill with COVID-19 recently and treated with monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasma in the past 90 days, that's typically in a hospital setting, you should wait the 90 days before you get your vaccine, because it just won't work as well. And then some precautions. These are not contraindications. You could still get the vaccine, but you should talk to your healthcare provider. If you have moderate to severe acute illness, probably just wait until you're not sick. And then if you have a history of something called an immediate allergic reaction to another vaccine or injectable therapy, so such as bad hive outbreak, swelling of the tongue and lips, having any respiratory distress like wheezing, you might consider getting a different vaccine or talking to your healthcare provider just to make sure that they feel safe giving it to you. Next slide. Long-term safety data, obviously, we don't have that information yet, but I thought that I'd include this, this answer from the American Academy of Pediatrics on this question, because I know it's, of course, on everybody's mind that have children. And I liked what they said when they say no vaccines licensed have been found to have an unexpected long-term safety problem that was found only years or decades after introduction. And so we've done a lot of safety data already on this. We think it's very safe, and the likelihood that there's going to be something that pops up years later is pretty much minuscule. Next slide, please. A few other things that you should know about COVID vaccines. You can be vaccinated after COVID-19 infection once you're recovered from illness. So that's a minimum of 10 days and with symptom improvement. You can also choose to wait. You probably have natural antibodies for a while, somewhere between 3 to 8 months is what our current data is saying. But you can also get vaccinated anytime after that point. Also, one of the reasons why we're talking about this and encouraging people as soon as they're eligible to get vaccinated is that current evidence shows that these vaccines are working well against the variants that are the mutations that are happening. But as more of the variants circulate, as more time passes, unfortunately, we can have who knows what in the future, and the vaccines might not be good enough for them. In fact, many of the manufacturers are already trying to look at what they can do preemptively to help. It might be a third booster dose. We'll find out. But hopefully for right now, we can stave this off by getting as many people vaccinated as possible. Questions have come up about when younger children will be eligible for vaccines. And from what I heard from Pfizer, they say in September of 2021, they're likely to request emergency use authorization for ages 2 and up. And then I'm guessing Moderna will be shortly behind. And then sometime in the late fall or winter, likely 6 months and up. And that's probably as low as they'll go. And then again, reasons why we're thinking about this. If a child's not vaccinated, they're more likely to have asymptomatic infections. But even if they're asymptomatic, they're able to spread it. So it can affect community members who are immunocompromised, other children. It keeps them, keeps schools from functioning and normal things like sporting events from happening. So we need children to be vaccinated to help with herd immunity. Next slide. And just a kind of a picture of how herd immunity works. In that top picture, nobody has any immunity. And so one person with the contagious disease, so COVID-19 in this case, can spread to many people, especially with these new variants that are popping up that tend to be even more and more likely to be transmitted. They're more contagious. As people begin to gain immunity, it's less likely that they're going to spread to large groups of people, but it can, it's helpful, but it's not perfect. So people still can get sick. But if we can build a wall where even if one person gets infected, they can't transmit it to anybody else, that's how we keep COVID-19 or this pandemic from causing us any further concern. And so that's why we want to reach this thing called herd immunity, if at all possible, with either vaccination or natural immunity. We don't know the exact number. We're thinking that somewhere between 70 to 80% need to be immune for this to be achieved. Next slide. So the last thing I'll say is what happens once you're vaccinated. So recent recommendations, and I'm sure many people are aware from the CDC, have said that fully vaccinated people, again, that's 2 weeks after the final dose, can resume normal activities without physical distancing or wearing masks. The little caveat is that you still should comply with any local, state, or workplace guidelines. And you should also still wear masks in healthcare settings and on public transportation. We just don't know who's vaccinated. We don't know why they're not vaccinated. It could be many different reasons. We want to help keep everybody safe. The other thing that you don't have to do, which is lovely, is that you, if you've been exposed to someone that you know has COVID-19, you no longer need to quarantine or get tested unless you start having symptoms. If you start having symptoms, please do go get tested. And the only exception is if you live in a prison, jail, or a homeless shelter, then we do require asymptomatic testing. And next slide, please. So that ends my portion, and I'm going to turn it over to Gina to tell you how can you get this vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Mudge. That was great information. So where is the vaccine available? We have a website that is updated weekly, and it indicates here, you can see the key in the bottom right-hand corner of which types of vaccines are available. This is for all 4 of our counties. It includes information on how to make an appointment, to call them directly. It's pretty thorough, and our team's done a great job to make sure our community is aware of where they can access this. We also have a mobile vaccine work group that's working to bring that to businesses and other entities who have, anyone greater than 0 at this point, because they're just willing to vaccinate those who are interested. So that's a great resource, and our call center will be on this last page to be able to access that information. So most, as Sandy mentioned, are taking walk-in appointments. Some do still require an appointment, but many are taking walk-in just because they know if you're there and you're interested and you're willing, and you're having those conversations with the person providing that vaccine, then they want to be able to give that to you. And then just a reminder that anyone over the age of 12 to 17 can only receive Pfizer, but we anticipate Moderna to be approved here shortly with the EUA, and then that will become more broadly available. So next slide, please. I just wanted to do a few quick recaps, and you did a great job addressing some of these questions, but we get these from our call center and through just the community answering the particular questions about, do we have to wait? I know my child's overdue for these other immunizations. Do we have to have that 14-day gap? So can you just reiterate the answer for that particular question?
Yes, correct. We were previously waiting for 14 days, but now we are saying let's just do all the vaccines at the same time. So we know many children got behind because we just weren't going to the doctors during the first year of this pandemic. You can get all your vaccines on the same day when you see a provider. And that list that was on the previous page are great resources, but many people's personal physicians are probably also having these in their clinics that they will just open with the first patient that's willing to get it in a day. So you're likely to be able to just get it at your physician's office too. So I would call them to ask.
Thank you. Next slide. So the question that we may not know the answer to about the vaccine is, are we going to need to do this every year like we do with the flu vaccine? And when do you think we may know what that outcome might be?
Yeah, unfortunately, nobody knows the answer to this. There's lots of speculation. It is possible that this is going to become one of the routine vaccines like a flu vaccine. We just don't know how long immunity from either natural immunity, so having had the actual infection, or vaccine immunity is going to last. We suspect, because in most cases vaccine immunity lasts longer, that the vaccine immunity will last longer. We also don't know what the virus itself is going to do. We know it mutates quickly, and is it going to mutate enough that after being given 2 doses of the vaccine, or 1 dose in the case of Janssen, how long we'll be protected before those mutations change things enough that we need to have another vaccine, such as what happens with the flu vaccine every year.
Great, thank you. And next slide, I think, last question. Do we know when to expect the vaccine to be open for the younger kids? So 2 and up, I believe, is what Pfizer's headed for.
Yes, we think, well, they have announced that they should be asking as early as September 2021 for ages 2 to 12. And then already there's many clinical studies undergoing for ages 6 months and up. So we expect that to happen in later fall or winter, but we'll see.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So this last one just has information. If you have questions, you're welcome to call our call center. The enrolled vaccine provider list is also listed here, as well as multiple information that you can find on our website. So I think with that concludes our presentation. I want to thank Dr. Mudge for her time and her expertise, and for all of you for listening. We appreciate it. And please reach out to us if there's anything else we can do to answer your specific questions. So have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Gina.
Stream's off.
Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Dr. Mudge.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more participants, or were we